On this episode of What's Going On with Shipping, it's the February 8th, 2022 edition of What the Ship, top 5 stories in the maritime sector. I am your host, Sal Mercogliano, and welcome to What the Ship. And man, there's some ship going on here. There's a lot going on. Sorry for not getting the video out yesterday on Monday, but circumstances and work schedule kind of interfered. But let's go ahead and jump into our stories. But first, I want to talk about the issue regarding the Russia-Ukraine. So if you're interested in that, again, we've done some videos on that. We did 3 specific videos that we'll have in the show notes and link to right above here so that you can go ahead and take a look at what would happen should the United States need to respond to an incursion by Russia into Ukraine. How would we, what's called sea lift, move military forces from the United States over there via shipping? Interesting topic, a lot going on with that. So if that piques your interest, be sure to check it out. So let's jump into story number 1. Story number 1, global supply chain. It is the story that we keep talking about a lot. And this past week, a lot of stories with a lot of intricacies, all from throughout the spectrum, but I want to kind of bring them together here under this banner. And I start off here with Sam Chambers' story from Splash 24/7. Global seaborne trade volumes forecast to grow 3.5% this year. Understand, global seaborne trade had dropped in 2020 because of COVID, and then we saw a growth here in 2021. But as Sam talks about right here, we're expected to see global trade continue, which usually is around the norm. Around 3-4% is what we've been seeing. So we're getting back into normal levels here. But that growth still is a little bit on the high side, because one of the things we're seeing is where that growth goes and how it unveils. So this container ship market, charter market sets fresh records. We are seeing container ship charters booming at this time. I mean, just the rates alone. There's a story here, 2,756 TEU. It's a tiny container ship, big back years ago, but now it's a fairly small one. Sets new record, fixed for 50 days at $175,000 a day. $175,000 a day. Understand, this vessel will pay for itself with just this charter. You're talking about 1.75 million every 10 days times 5. I mean, you're talking about a lot of money just for the chartering of this vessel. Companies are paying off their vessels like crazy right now, which means they're going to be flush with cash, and we can expect the order books to go nuts here in the future. This one here from Freightway, supply chain chaos and port gridlock could drag into 2023. This is Greg Miller talking about forecasts. Again, we saw a slight dip in rates a few months ago, and everybody was prophesizing it's all over, everything's good, we're back to normal. But when you start breaking into the data, start looking at shipping, you start realizing this is not the case. Just look at Port of LA and Long Beach right now, and huge delays off that port, which we'll come to, but not just this, but other ports. And you see that stronger for longer. We're looking at freight rates still being high, still seeing those massive amounts of container ships waiting for the berth. That chart right there is one of the best. You can see right here in November when they started shifting the ships offshore, yet it had, while the number waiting for the port have dropped, the number in total that LA and Long Beach don't like to talk about have increased. And all of that plays into this. We're seeing container transit time struggling to pick up steam, data shows. It's taking longer. As freight rates increase, you're getting poorer service, meaning that ships are not rotating fast enough. It is taking longer. Right here, transit time from Dalian to the eastern British port of Felixstowe, which had been some of the biggest backlogs in Europe, reached 85 days in January from 81 in November versus 65 days in January of 2020. You add 20 days to a 65-day normal voyage, that means you're adding a third of the time, which means that the time to get back is increased, which means your total number of sailings per year is decreasing. You are losing tonnage, vessels, ships, because of the turnaround, because ships are not moving as quickly as they need to be. That means less capacity. That means you're increasing freight rates. That means it's more difficult to move cargo through. We're seeing a slowing down of the system. We're losing a study I haven't been done yet, but what I'd love to see is taking all these delays and equating them to ships and vessels. And we're probably losing one of the major steam lines, container lines, through just vessels idling at this time. That feeding frenzy is also adding to supply chain pressures because of the feeder vessels, the issue with getting the smaller vessels feeding into the larger vessels, or feeding out from the large ports to the smaller ports. This is putting a big strain on feeder vessels. This is slowing everything down. Add to it this study from Kuhn and Nagel that shows the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach responsible for the majority of delays. I don't know how much money they got for that study. You could have paid me and I could have came up with the same results, probably for a lot cheaper. I am a college professor. I will work for almost nothing because that's what we do. But again, we're seeing these disruptions. And again, we're seeing it on the Trans-Pacific where congestion is causing blank sailings. In other words, those ships are canceling future sailings because they're too occupied. And the cartel liner competition has increased as Trans-Pacific rates spike. This is an interesting story because one of the things that they're talking about here is the introduction of these new shipping lines that are getting into the service. And what we're seeing is container ships are being moved off other services into the Trans-Pacific, the Trans-Europe-Asia service, which means poor service to places like Africa, South America, Australia, New Zealand. They're more reliable, but there's less of them going. And so one of the things you're seeing here are the capacity changes in the carriers right now. MSC has bought everything that they can get their hands on. But this story right here, the niche container lines outperform the top 14, is a really interesting story. I just want to go to this graph right here. These are the top major lines. We're looking at them right there. We're seeing their decrease in reliability, Maersk from 70% down to 46%. Meanwhile, lines like, let's see, Matson line right here, which has decreased from 69 to 57, still a better performance than the big carriers. But you're sitting there going, well, wait a minute, Sal, here are these smaller carriers. They're doing better. They're going to start eclipsing the big carriers. They don't have the capacity. They don't have the capacity. They don't have the network. They don't have the connections, which means that once this all starts to die down, the big container lines are going to gobble up the smaller ones unless the smaller ones can get themselves into some niche services. Matson, for example, is a Jones Act carrier. They operate between U.S. ports, principally West Coast to Hawaii. Plus, their berth in Long Beach cannot be accessed by many other ships because of a bridge that requires smaller vessels to get under it. But one of the things you're seeing here is that Alliance schedule availability, 2M, the Ocean, and the Alliance, their reliability is just tanking. So again, everybody keeps talking about things are getting better in the global shipping market and things are getting better with the supply chain, not seeing it here right now. That's story number one. Story number two, have no fear. Legislation is coming from the US Congress to solve the supply chain issues. Okay, maybe not. Maybe they're not coming to save us, but there is legislation coming. We talked about a few weeks ago that the House has passed the Ocean Reform Act. Well, the Senate has passed their version of Ocean Reform Act. So this bipartisan ocean shipping reform bill is introduced in Senate. Now, what you have is two separate bills introduced by two separate houses. What's going to happen here is you're going to have to get a reconciliation committee or a conference committee together, take those two bills, marry them together, and then send them back to the two individual houses for votes. They can still change them, and then they have to come back again. But what we're seeing in the Senate bill is really interesting. We know that the World Shipping Council has not liked it. The World Shipping Council is the lobby group for most of the world's container operators. And we have a statement right here from the World Shipping Council. It is clear that further regulating ocean carriers will not solve the deeper challenges in U.S. supply chains. That's a statement from the World Shipping Council. This may not be their actual spokesman, but I do believe, yes, here it is. It's right here. So here's this FreightWave story that talks about it. The Shipping Council is sitting there saying, listen, regulation will not solve the deeper challenges in the US supply chain, which I agree. However, there are issues that need to be resolved. If you look at what the Senate specifically is doing, and this is in both the G Captain story and the FreightWave story, right here, they want to require ocean carriers to certify that late fees, known in maritime parlance as detention demurrage charges, comply with federal regulations or face penalties. A lot of shippers are getting charged detention and demurrage late fees for the pickup or the return of containers, yet it's not clearly articulated in their agreements. They want to shift the burden of proof regarding reasonableness of detention demurrage charges from the invoice party to the ocean carrier. Okay, right now, if you get charged a false or what you consider a unreasonable charge, you have to basically file suit against the ocean carrier for it. Now, ocean carriers are going to have to prove that their rate is reasonable beforehand. They want to prohibit ocean carriers from unreasonably declining shipping opportunities for U.S. exports as determined by the FMC in new required rulemaking. This is the one the World Shipping Council hates because it's going to require them to take American exports over empties. Understand, again, happy to show you the video where we use Lego blocks to prove the fact that empties are piling up in West Coast ports to the point where we are exporting for every one full container, 3 empty containers. That was 1 to 2 previously. Now it's 1 to 3. And what World Shipping Council continually wants to say, again, we go to their spokesman, what they are saying is that that's going to put undue burden on them. What they really mean to say is, listen, if you make us take exports, that's going to slow us down from unloading that container in Asia, packing it with new material, getting it to the port, and then putting it on a ship, heading across to Europe or Asia, where we charge really huge rates. That's free market capitalism. Completely understand that. However, you're using US ports, you're using US facilities, and denying US exports in your vessel, prioritizing empties over that. And I'm not saying you have to take 100% empties. We're not even talking about 1 to 1. We're talking about getting back to the 2 to 1, 2 empties for 1 full that they used to be. We're at 3 to 1 right now. Go in here, require ocean common carriers to report to the FMC each calendar quarter on total import export tonnage and 20-foot equivalent units per vessels that make port in the US. Data. Can I be clear? Ocean carriers are not sharing data. They do for their freight forwarders and certain elements, but there is no open source data. Ocean carriers are terrible about this. Today, I order something from Amazon. I could track it from shipment to my doorstep. You can't typically do that all the time with ocean containers, let alone get a clear image of what's on a ship. Different alliance members will show different cargo or different loads on different ships. You won't get the same data. Next one, authorize the FMC to self-initiate investigations of ocean common carrier business practices and apply enforcement measures. They don't want to wait anymore for shippers to file suit against ocean carriers because they worry about the ocean carriers intimidating the shippers or reprisals against the shippers. The FMC wants the ability to legislate or to investigate against them. And finally, establish new authority for the FMC to register shipping exchanges. All of these are great. I would argue one thing that's fundamentally I have not seen in these bills, and that is plussing up the FMC. The FMC needs more staff, more money, more technology to do all this. Understand, they are underfunded. They've been cut since the Shipping Act of '84, the Ocean Reform Act of '98. We have deregulated this, and we've benefited greatly from this. We get low shipping rates for most of history, but now we're reaping the benefit, or they're reaping the benefits with massive profits, while we are on the receiving end. And I mean Americans. So this is a start. Does the World Shipping Council have some points? Yes, they do. And let me be clear, everybody should be heard on this. There should be hearings. There should be a joint hearing on the revised bill that's eventually going to go before the House and the Senate. But they can't sit there and say that this has not been talked about for a long time. You have this meeting here, this Q&A that Lorianne LaRocco did with John Porcari, the current port envoy, which is great, where he talks about that current volumes are the floor, not the ceiling. I don't know if I agree with that. I think we're going to drop back down to some normality, but nowhere near to what we are. It's an interesting, Lorianne does great Q&A. I would have loved to sat in and watch this. I would have asked a gazillion more questions, but he would have interviewed with me. So that's why I can never get that from him. You go in here, FMC seeks comments on new detention to demerge. Again, FMC is working. I hop on the FMC all the time, but they are doing an amazing amount of work with the resources they have. And so what we're seeing here is a lot of work being done. This new Ocean Reform Act, the first reform legislation since 1998, which repealed laws, didn't add laws, is going to be significant. But again, I do think we need to have some hearings on this and get the perspective from not just the World Shipping Council, but from shipping lines, from shippers themselves, from terminal operators, from port operators, and then hammer out a bill and get it passed. Need to get this passed sooner rather than later, or else it will drop from everyone's attention and nothing will be done. That is story number 2. Story number 3 builds on the issue about Russia and Ukraine, with this story talking about energy shipments to Europe. This story, which was on G-Captain, talks about how dependent is Europe on natural gas and who are its main suppliers. This comes from The Conversation, and it talks about how dependent is Europe on this. And again, one of the things we're seeing is where those LNG is coming from. Russia is the largest supplier of natural gas to Europe, sending about 40% of the continent's supplies shipped by pipeline. The next largest suppliers via pipeline are Norway, Algeria, and Azerbaijan. In recent months, European imports of liquefied natural gas from the US and elsewhere have reached record levels at around 400 million cubic meters per day. Put that in perspective, a single LNG can hold roughly 125 to 175,000 cubic meters of natural gas. That's enough energy to warm 17 million British homes for one British winter. And again, one of the things we're seeing is this factor. LNG is, and they go into the whole process here, how it's made. But the biggest issue right now is shipments of LNG across the ocean are filling in the gap by Russia not shipping LNG. It talks about here about 2/3 of the LNG is sold under firm long-term contracts with fixed destinations. Some major contract holders like South Korea, Japan, and China, and their suppliers are willing to redirect cargoes to Europe if a further cutback in Russian exports creates a worsening supply crisis. We saw that. We saw China release some LNG cargoes so that they can sail to Europe. This article goes on, will increase U.S. shipments to Europe drive up prices for U.S. consumers? Well, this next story talks about it. The glut of U.S. LNG heading to Europe sends freight rates below zero, and it's not the temperature of the LNG they're talking about. The cost to transport a shipment of U.S. liquefied natural gas to energy-starved Europe turned negative. Spot freight rates in the Atlantic crashed to negative $750 per day on Tuesday, down from $270,000 in early December, according to Spark Commodities, which tracks LNG prices. That's the first time as the market has turned negative in Spark data going back to 2019, and means that owners are paying charterers to use their ships. That is probably not going to last long, I'm going to tell you right now. It's an interesting development. The surge in shipments to Europe has never left fewer vessels available in Asia, with freight rates in the Pacific Basin at 16,250 per day on Tuesday. This has to do with the glut of shipments going in and the perspective. It's people overbuying LNG right now in Europe by sea for fear of what's going on between Russia and Ukraine and the potential for the market to get shut off. So they're just overly buying LNG at this point, to the point that the market's just going crashing. That has not, according to a Lodestar story, deterred carriers from ordering new builds. We're seeing the investment in LNG carriers going up. Investment in LNG fueled ships has continued at pace. We're also seeing not just LNG fueled vessels, but the building of LNG vessels that transport them going up. And LNG fuel is really hot right now, not just for power sources on shore, but also on vessels. And as more vessels shift over to LNG fuel, that demand is going to increase. So again, this interesting play right now going on with Europe and how dependent Europe is on LNG. And what Russia's doing is going to be a big element in the energy sector, something to watch and develop. Lots to that story. That was story number 3. Story number 4, what the ship was going on last week with vessels running aground, beaching themselves, blowing up. There was a lot last week. If you didn't catch it all last week, want to kind of recap where we're at. So we talked about Trinity Spirit, again, a vessel we talked about in a video. And Trinity Spirit was this FPSO, this fuel platform, fuel production, storage, and offloading platform off the coast of Nigeria, which I get some great comments about that too. I always love when people tell me I don't know what I'm talking about. I absolutely love those comments. I appreciate it. I don't know everything. I really don't. I'm happy to learn more. I'm not a PhD in all aspects of shipping, but I try to provide knowledge as much as I can. Do I get things wrong? Yeah, human. Sorry. But in this story, the Trinity Spirit, an old tanker converted into an FPSO, suffers a catastrophic explosion. We know that 3 crew members were rescued from the time. They talk about here the 10 crew members who were on board the time explosion early on Wednesday remain unaccountable, but according to witnesses and fears, they might have been caught in the fire. We know 3 have been found. 7 of them are still missing. The explosion was catastrophic on this vessel. This vessel was very poorly maintained. We know that based on reports coming out of it, and you can see that the entire center part of the vessel blew apart, caught on fire, and sank. Huge disaster off the coast of Nigeria. But we had other stories going on here. This is the story with the crew members found alive, that follow-up story here talking about that. But this vessel off Reunion Island in the Indian Ocean came ashore. This is a story about a Mauritian tanker, the MT Trust a Star, that came ashore off Reunion Island. So that story was going on last week. We talked about this story earlier, actually last week in What the Ship, the bulk carrier Julia D that got under tow. She had been struck by a vessel, flooded her engine room, but tugs were able to get her, salvage her, bring her into port. We talked about the Mumbai Maersk, which was pulled off the embankment going into Bremerhaven. No damage was reported to the vessel, although the vessel is going in for a survey to be found out. The U.S. Navy, a ship chartered to the Military Sealift Command, this sea tug right here, the Sea Eagle, which tows barges out to an underwater test range in the Bahamas, lost power, came ashore, washed ashore on a beach off Florida, along with its barge. They've been able to pull it off and remove it. This story, an oil tanker coming into Kaohsiung, Taiwan, hit the breakwater and suffered a puncture in the side, put a big, huge list. We had a story a couple of months ago about a ship coming into Kaohsiung, took out a container crane. This vessel, tanker, hits the breakwater and starts taking on water. And then finally, we get this story about Express Pearl, the vessel that burst into flames off Colombo months ago, being completed. Just a lot going on with shipping. Again, it's not unusual. About a ship is sunk every 2 weeks at sea on average. And accidents are happening all the time. A lot more visibility with them thanks to internet and everybody having cell phones and our ability to track vessels through AIS. But definitely an amazing week in terms of shipping news. Finally, story number 5 is stories that I always like to chop into, and I've been asked a lot about doing things beyond just international shipping. So I'm going to give you 2 stories right here that link into it. One is wind farms, the development of wind farms in the United States. This is off the coast of the United States. This involves using Jones Act vessels. So there's a lot going on with this. So 2 stories here. The first, offshore wind sector could face bottlenecks as size of turbines outpace installation ships. This is a wind farm, an offshore wind farm. And one of the things you'll notice with this vessel is it is actually lifted up. It's a jack-up vessel. It actually puts out these legs, jacks itself up to stabilize it so it's not rocking. So then a crane can be used to install the base of the fan and then the turbine blades themselves. But as turbines get bigger, you obviously need bigger vessels, and that's causing a problem as vessel size obviously is restricted. Add to it this, Entity shelves plans for Jones Act compliant offshore wind turbine installation vessel. For a vessel to install a wind farm off the coast of the United States, the vessel has to be built in the United States. Now, the components on the vessel that install the wind farm don't. the crane, the material, all the kind of major elements to do it. Doesn't have to be, but the vessel themselves has to be. Entity was going to contract with a U.S. yard, not identified in the story, but they were doing it in conjunction with South Korea's Daewoo Shipbuilding, who they had built a vessel with, but they had been unable to get into a deal with a shipyard and basically pull back. What they say is this: we believe the U.S. market for offshore wind will offer significant opportunities for the company in the future, but right now we are focused on delivering on our existing commitments and deriving value for our existing fleet. It's expensive to build a Jones Act vessel compared to one built in Korea that's heavily subsidized by Korea. So one of the things we need to be thinking about is what can we do to incentivize to build vessels in the United States? Do we subsidize, meaning giving cash to the operator or the shipbuilder? Do we give tax revenue or tax incentives? Do we provide low interest loans that will basically amortize the cost over a greater period than maybe they can get with a commercial loan? Those are things we can think about. And I think we need to think about. We need to do this. Now, what people will tell you is that this is the problem. The Jones Act is preventing this from happening. No, we need a commercial maritime infrastructure in this country because we are a maritime power. Look at the US Navy. I get people who tell me all the time, you want freedom of the seas, you want to be able to move goods, that requires the US Navy. A US Navy needs shipyards to build, repair, and maintain. And guess what? There's not enough military vessels being built, not enough military vessels out there to keep a commercial infrastructure. We need a commercial shipping infrastructure to support that. And that's why we need this. And then the last part of this story is a great one up on the Great Lakes. Lack of Coast Guard icebreakers disrupt shipping on the Great Lakes, says task force. Talks about two of my favorite things to talk about. I don't get a chance to talk about enough: the Great Lakes and the U.S. Coast Guard. The Great Lakes freeze over. They can become solid sheets of ice, except for like one little part by the Niagara Falls. But one of the things that keeps open the Great Lakes is US and Canadian icebreakers opening it up. Now, you can't keep it open year round, but the cusp is the beginning and the end of winter. And without suitable Coast Guard icebreakers, vessels can become trapped, as this story talks about right here, where you actually get a vessel stuck in the ice and you have to go out and free it. I think we need to invest more in icebreakers. We just do. We need to invest more in our Great Lakes fleet too. Let me be clear. We're just now building the first new vessel in about 40 years on the Great Lakes. Now, let me be clear. Ships on the Great Lakes last a long time because you're sailing in fresh water, not salt water, so they can last a long time. But we need to invest in this. And I think this is an area that doesn't get enough attention. Hope you enjoyed the stories this week. I hope you tune in every week to What the Ship. We usually come out on Monday, sometimes Tuesday, depending on my work schedule, with 5 stories that you can see and cap into. We have features during the week, so if you want to catch those features during the week, please subscribe to the channel, hit the bell so you'll be alerted about new videos when they come out. Be sure to leave a comment, give it a thumbs up, not that thumbs down, thumbs up all the time. Thumbs up, that helps spread what's going on with shipping across the internet. Share it across social media, and if you can, contribute to our Patreon page. That allows me the time and the effort to go ahead and do this, put this out, and give you a quality product when it comes to maritime shipping. Until our next broadcast, this is Sal, signing off.